Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Friday forum on Monday. Um, yeah, just to accommodate everything, we're happy we could do this even on different type of day. I'd like just take a moment to have if you're celebrating any holiday, there's obviously a lot of holidays this weekend. Various faith traditions. I would like to uh, wish you the best times. To this Monday, we have, we're happy to host Dr. Laura Wolf Powers, Associate Professor, Department of Urban Policy and Planning at Hunter College in the City University of New York, as she presents in our last Friday forum her new book, University City, which chronicles 5 decades of planning in and around West Philadelphia's University City. The UIC CUPS group of PhD students and the faculty and staff of CUPA and UPP, very happy to welcome Dr. Laura Wolf Powers. And I will transition before we do that, I just wanted to remind you, if you are online, please keep yourself on mute. Put questions in the chat and we'll do Q&A at the end. And please use the hand function or the reactions so we can see you. And if you missed previous Friday forums, please check out our website. Now, Dr. Laura Powers.
Where should I stand to be seen on the Zoom and in the room both?
Yeah. Yeah, probably sit. Most people
Okay.
sit
All right.
good,
Okay.
and the angle works.
Okay,
Yeah.
great, perfect. Okay. Thank you for inviting me to present. My talk today is actually centered on, whoops. Let's see. Okay, there you go. Centered on negotiation and bargaining. I have a couple of versions of the talk that comes out of my book, and sometimes I focus on the concept of the innovation district itself and kind of where it fits in the urban economy of the 21st century. This presentation is more about reactions among mobilized groups of civil society organizations and so on, in response to university-led development that they are thinking that they believe isn't really creating the city for all that they would like to be happening. So, as you know, this talk is adapted from my book, University City. It came out last September from University of Pennsylvania Press, and it traces, as Derek said in this introduction, about a half a century of redevelopment policy and activism in the neighborhood in West Philadelphia known as University City, which is where both University of Pennsylvania and Drexel are located. University City is interesting to look at because it's an urban neighborhood where municipal officials and academic institutions and mobilized community advocates have engaged over a lot of decades in conversations and arguments about space, political voice and resources, and the question of who benefits from and who sacrifices as a result of university-sponsored redevelopment programs and related economic and social policies. Trying to understand what has changed and what has not changed about university-led redevelopment since the urban renewal era, I reviewed a lot of archival documents. I interviewed dozens of people, and I attended monthly meetings of a local civic association, the Mantua Civic Association, over the course of about 18 months in 2015 and 2016. This is a sort of this is a map that my research assistant created of the area that I'm looking at. It consists of a little bit of, okay.
Yeah, It wasn't sharing. It was sharing this. I
Oh,
think.
okay. That. Yes, okay. Um, Okay, yeah, so this is the this book is about West Philadelphia, and you see the Schuylkill River here, as well as a little bit of the Penn campus, but mostly the Drexel campus and the neighborhoods around it in this image. And it's about this neighborhood and about these institutions, but it's also very much about the conditions that are generated by property market appreciation all across North America in areas that are adjacent to university-led redevelopment, or as they're termed in the policy literature, innovation districts. And what I conclude in the terms of a policy takeaway is that property-led economic development, and I argue that this is what innovation district development really boils down to, is a sort of property market strategy. It can only succeed in meeting equity and inclusion goals if both city governments and universities are willing to take a different approach, a kind of heterodox approach to landed housing in neighborhoods adjacent to the campus expansion projects. So that's kind of where I'm going with this. And I'm going to start now with the first bargaining table, which was 1969. At 11 a.m. on Tuesday, February 18th, 1969, a frigidly cold day, roughly 400 people assembled on the green in front of the University of Pennsylvania's College Hall in preparation for a march. They were responding to a call from the university's chapter of Students for Democratic Society, whose leaders were determined to cast light on the consequences of university-led expansion a few blocks from campus. The demonstrators' destination was a construction site where you see that yellow star, and it was in the University City Urban Renewal Area, Unit 3, where the University City Science Center, as well as a new public high school, were soon to replace what had been, according to the 1960 census, a neighborhood containing 1,407 homes and 69 businesses. A residents group, the Citizens Committee for University City Urban Renewal Area Unit 3, which is a mouthful, had obtained a commitment from the Philadelphia Redevelopment Authority to build replacement housing in this area here, where the lower arrow is pointing. But the Redevelopment Authority had broken this promise, and the plight of displaced or soon to be displaced residents, particularly people who'd been homeowners in this neighborhood and had gotten and who were having their wealth basically stripped from them, had gotten the attention of radicalized students from Penn and other area universities. So there was a speech, Reverend Edward Sims, a leader who represented the residents of the neighborhood known as Greenville or Black Bottom, which is what you see cleared here. He said, this is your day. The university has taken some 30 acres of land from the Blacks of this community. Are you good enough to get 1 acre of it back for us? So this was the students then staged a theatrical performance designed to dramatize the legalized dispossession being carried out by the Philadelphia Redevelopment Authority. And then they returned to College Hall. Oh, this is an image of all the University City redevelopment areas, and Unit 3 is where the neighborhood Black Bottom that was in the midst of demolition and this moment was located. And you can see that there are other redevelopment areas closer to Drexel's campus and to Penn's campus. So the students returned to College Hall, where they intercepted University President Gaylord Harnwell on his way back from lunch. In addition to being Penn's president, Harnwell was also the president of the West Philadelphia Corporation, a multilateral organization that constituted the main source of power behind the Science Center development and other expansion in West Philadelphia. Aggrieved students proceeded to sit in at the university building for the next 5 days as they negotiated a set of demands, first among themselves and then with the university trustees. On Sunday, February 23rd, the trustees and the students, with the endorsement of the faculty senate and a delegation of West Philadelphia Black leaders, released a 6-point agreement that ended the students' occupation. The trustees had agreed 2 days previously that the Science Center would agree not to accept classified military-related research contracts. So there's kind of a double purpose for this protest. So it was about militarization of university research. It was also about the displacement of families from a nearby neighborhood. The students and community activists and Penn trustees ended this occupation with an agreement to create a commission on university community development, consisting of 5 student representatives, 5 faculty members, 5 trustees, and 5 community members. And so these were the negotiators, the direct negotiators. In the background were the Philadelphia Redevelopment Authority, who was funding the whole project, the Philadelphia School District, which had agreed to locate a high school right in the very area where the Redevelopment Authority had pledged to build replacement housing for people who were being displaced. And then, of course, the federal government, which was the source of the financing for this, and the West Philadelphia Corporation. So the agreement specified that there would be this quadripartite commission created, and that it would be empowered to review and approve plans involving future land acquisition or development in the urban renewal area. Although the University City Science Center and University City High School were by that point under construction, not all the property in Unit 3 had been transferred to the Redevelopment Authority. So there was still a chance that that some of the residents could be relocated within the same neighborhood where they had been living before. And the commission also, this agreement also stated that the commission would oversee and direct a fund of $10 million, which is about $80 million in today's dollars, that the university would make available for community development in the surrounding neighborhoods. So if you think that, if you're in reading this paragraph here, if you're thinking that the language about the community development fund looks a little tortured, you're right, because this is not actually what happened. Although it would take more than a year for the commission to officially fall apart, fault lines were immediately evident when the commission began to meet. And the entire Black Bottom neighborhood ended up being destroyed, except for one row of houses on a street called Warren Street. So at the group's first meeting in March of 1969, community representatives expressed an eagerness to proceed with the housing rehabilitation work they believed that the February agreement had authorized them to undertake in partnership with local organizations. However, there was no consensus about whether and how university funds would flow to local organizations. Community representatives imagined that they might create a development staff and then draw on this $10 million commitment to finance housing construction and rehabilitation, as well as other projects. It gradually became clear, though, that the university did not intend to contribute its own funds, because the agreement had stated, after all, only that trustees would, quote unquote, concert their efforts to develop funds and funding sources. So the quadripartite commission never incorporated, and in December 1969, faculty representative John Ekman instructed the university's legal counsel to halt the process, citing the danger that the incorporation will only serve to focus undesirable scrutiny on the interpretation of the trustees' much debated $10 million promise last February. So while the university and the West Philadelphia Corporation contributed a few $100,000 to local organizations in the following years, the ambiguous $10 million commitment in the February agreement never came to pass. And this is something that a quote that I found in a set of oral histories that was in the Temple Urban Archives that I thought it was worth displaying here, just in the sense that G. Holmes Perkins is a much revered dean of University of Pennsylvania School of Architecture. He's known as a real leader and a progressive, and he was definitely part of liberal Philadelphia in that era. But this is I think that the quote that he gave to his interviewer, so this was, in 1976, a number of years after all this had happened, the quote that he gave to his interviewer sort of indicates, to my mind anyway, the sort of the sense of liberals that they were pursuing, sane, rational public policies. And if there were sacrifices to be made, then that was fine because it was sort of to the good of the entire community. But one of the arguments I make in the book is that it seems always to be low, economically struggling communities of color that end up making the sacrifices in the name of the welfare of the total community. Now I'm going to fast forward about 50 years to 2012, when Drexel University introduced a new campus plan and strategic plan that was really kind of its turn in the sun to do some expansion around its own campus. This is when I was teaching at Penn, and my introduction to community and economic development course was focused in part on neighborhood dynamics and neighborhood change in the Lower Lancaster corridor era. That red box is around the Lancaster Avenue, which, as you can see, doesn't really harmonize very well with the street grid. That's because it was there long before much of the built environment of West Philadelphia was there. It was a Native American trail. It was later a turnpike, one of the first sort of subscription turnpike in the United States. It goes all the way to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. But along Lancaster Avenue now, there are several different neighborhoods, as you can see: Mantua, Belmont, Saunders Park, Powelton, and Powelton Village. It was during this time when I was teaching this class and kind of using Lancaster Corridor as a focal point for the class, Drexel University introduced a campus plan. Just want me to admit this person. Said, okay, here we go. That they were going to create a 21st century district marked by livability, amenity, and accessibility that extended from 30th to 36th Streets and from Chestnut Street to Powelton Avenue. And this plan that the university introduced was kind of clear about the intention to enlarge the area of University City, the part of University City that students and visitors and employees would kind of identify with the Drexel campus. In a speech in 2013, and I'm actually going to move ahead for a second because I think I got my slides out of order. Yeah, this is what I was looking for. John Fry alluded to a series of mixed-use projects built in partnership with private developers, which he believed to be, quote, the future of major university development. And U City Square, which was taglined a community of ingenuity, was in fact announced in September 2015 on that site. So there was a second innovation district plan, Schuylkill Yards, that was announced the following year, 2016, on the eastern edge of campus near the edge of the Schuylkill River and the 30th Street train station. Now, if I can go back, let's see. Sorry about this. Okay, so the innovation development proposed for this area, the Lower Lancaster corridor, that I can't. All right, does that work? Okay. Yes. Yeah, that's where I wanted, but okay. Yeah, so this is the kind of building typology of the neighborhood, mostly early late 19th century and early 20th century row houses. And Lancaster was a kind of troubled commercial corridor. There were a lot of commercial establishments with vacant apartments above them. But increasingly as particularly as the university's plans became more widely known, so this is the rendering of the Schuylkill Yards development by the architects. But there was also a lot of vacant land and vacant lots in the neighborhood. And as the university's development plans became known, increasingly people were buying up vacant homes and demolishing them, or buying vacant lots and replacing them with student housing that looked something like this. So that was kind of what was happening in the neighborhood. And then on this site of the University City Square Innovation District itself was actually the University City High School, which had been built in the early 70s, and that had to be demolished. So over a course of a year, as I was doing my research, I was observing this very fortress-like, and there was a huge amount of embodied energy in this building, and I was observing the gradual dismantling of this building to be replaced by this new innovation district that Drexel had envisioned. And University City High School had been on a list of schools that the Philadelphia School District had planned to close due to low enrollment in 2013. And it was, although there were students and alumni who fought to save it, or at least to kind of keep the school community together, the building was on such a valuable piece of real estate that it was destroyed. And Drexel bought it the following months after the school closure decision. Then that was Drexel's sort of signal to buy the property. While all this was going on, there were other planning processes occurring in neighborhoods along the lower Lancaster corridor in this area, sort of north of Lancaster Avenue. And this is the neighborhood that I'm most interested in, which I focus on a lot in the book, its history and its sort of present day politics. So there, Palatine Village and Mantua were both next to each other, and Palatine Village Civic Association released its plan called the Directions Plan. And then shortly after, in 2013, the board of directors of something called the Mount Vernon Manor Community Development Corporation published the Mantua Transformation Plan as part of a federal choice neighborhoods planning grant. In contrast to the Drexel campus plan, these two plans expressed the interests and anxieties of residents whose neighborhoods stood to be affected by the development of these two multi-billion-dollar innovation district projects, U City Square and Schuylkill Yards. So these organizations saw university-led redevelopment on the horizon, and in that context, they were asserting their own claims on place. And I'm particularly interested in the Mantua Transformation Plan because it really lays out the intention of residents in that neighborhood to maintain the community's identity in the midst of change. This plan spawned really the Mantua Civic Association, which is the organization whose meetings I attended for about a year and a half. And this is a group of leaders pursuing development in their neighborhood, which they see as compatible with the community's character, namely renter and owner occupied units affordable to people with stable but relatively low incomes. So you can kind of see this intention expressed in the quote from the plan that I have up there. As I mentioned, I attended meetings of this organization. They met in a local rec center and a local church, and they were very intent on following the university's plans for redevelopment, as well as various private development projects that were cropping up to build student housing, sort of amidst the buildings in their neighborhood. These are some statistics and photos that illustrate what was happening to the Mantua neighborhood at the time. And what this reflects really is the increasing development of housing marketed to students and the increasing expectation of property price appreciation in this neighborhood as this kind of live, work, play innovation district form of development was taking shape to the south. And I'll just read very briefly from the book. In addition to thinking about how to preserve existing housing, civic association members were also cognizant of the opportunities and risks posed by vacant property. The Manitoba Transformation Plan noted that vacant land represented 1/3 of all the parcels in the area, and that for every 5 housing units, 1 is vacant. So there was a lot of land that was actually in the public domain, either because it had been seized for tax foreclosure, mostly for that reason. And but about half of the vacant property was publicly owned. And to the extent that both the property and then subsidy to develop it could be obtained, that this presented the opportunity for mission-driven organizations to initiate new development that existing residents saw as compatible with the neighborhood that they knew and that they wanted to live in. But transforming publicly owned vacant land into affordable housing involved money, and it involved a lot of politics. So this was sort of the situation in which that was beginning to develop as the Manitoba Transformation Plan was coming into being. This is an interesting event that occurred in 2014, which was some students at the art school at Temple University created a project around a home on Mellon Street that was about to be demolished. It was called Funeral for a Home, and as you can see, the home was about to be demolished the following day, and they placed garlands of flowers over the house, and they had a preacher and a choir, and then they had a community meal on the street, which is what's depicted on the cover of the book. So the first opportunity to kind of assert this vision of a stable neighborhood that was nevertheless not a relatively low income or working class and yet stable neighborhood came in 2014 when the city government was asked to change the zoning on the site of the demolished University City High School. And in March of 2014, there was a community input session in Charette that drew over 100 participants representing a lot of civic organizations. A workshop followed at which leaders representing Mantua, Palatine Village, and West Palatine Saunders Park collaborated with volunteer architects to create community priorities for the reuse of the site. And then the council member at of that district sort of made her approval of the required zoning changes contingent on a community benefits agreement. So that sort of kicked off a negotiation. What resulted from that, it was a very tense negotiation. It was very frenzied. It was said that the deal had to be done, the purchase had to be made, and so they needed the zoning, and so it was very rushed. But when the city announced the agreement on June 14th of 2014, its terms were geared toward the priorities that had been articulated at this zoning workshop a few months earlier. So among these elements of the agreement had to do with restrictions on building heights, an assurance that housing on the site would not be constructed for or marketed to students, the inclusion of parking podiums to keep parked cars off neighborhood streets, and the articulation of a joint goal to create a public school on the site. Of course, this was a little bit ironic because they had just torn down a school, but now they were going to do this new school, a K-8 school. And the agreement also set some terms forward on which Drexel would provide financial assistance to other public schools in the area, and it provided for the formation of a community advisory group to provide for input into future site planning. And it also did include an economic opportunity plan setting targets for female, minority, and local resident participation in construction, employment, and contracting on the project. The economic opportunity plan was a legal requirement and constituted a standard feature of major projects requiring city approval. So it was kind of a codicil, if you will, to the community benefits agreement. So generally speaking, Powelton Village Civic Association members were pretty pleased because their priority had been to have the new development kind of harmonize with their neighborhood context and create a continuation of their neighborhood fabric. The Mantua representatives, however, were less than thrilled because they had sought an affordable housing requirement and more attention to economic inclusion and to jobs. In other words, they were looking for the agreement not just to mitigate the impact of new development, but to address social distress in a way that began to repair past harms and past wealth stripping. But because the Powelton Village Neighbors Association had better organizational resources, more political capital, they were paying the lawyer, they were leading the negotiation, and the resulting agreement primarily reflected their interests. So as you can see from this quote, the representative from the more economically vulnerable neighborhood was quite disappointed. He said all they wanted to talk about was parking and trees. They learned from this, and they were very active, the Mantua advocates active going into the second University City community benefits negotiation of this period. And this one was around the Schuylkill Yards development. Here, they really wanted to win some gains that would enable them to stabilize current Mantua homeowners and build new, deeply affordable housing. The Schuylkill Yards Innovation District, announced in 2016, was a partnership between Drexel and a hometown developer, Brandywine Realty Trust, which is a REIT, to develop 10 acres that the university had assembled on the east side of its campus near the 30th Street train station. Drexel's John Fry and Gerard H. Sweeney of Brandywine introduced the project in March 2016, unveiling a dramatic before and after rendering that juxtaposed a dull scene of surface parking and railroad tracks with an image of towers of various heights springing from this garden-like base. The development was going to be built in at least 2 phases, offering research labs, corporate offices, residential and retail spaces, and hospitality and cultural venues. And once again, Councilwoman Blackwell insisted on a community benefits agreement before she would greenlight the necessary rezoning. And this ended up being very important because there had been, in the past, there had been conflict among advocacy groups as groups had advocated sort of particularistic interests or attempted backdoor negotiations with the developer of the previous project outside of the official discussion forum. But for the Schuylkill Yards case, the council person basically, she said there has to be a community benefits agreement here, but she allowed Brandywine, the developer, to decide who would be the negotiators of it. So by the fall of 2016, Brandywine had apparently determined that its negotiating partner would be a coalition of organizations that called itself the Mantua Powelton Alliance, the Mantua Civic Association, the Mount Vernon Manor CDC, the Powelton Village Civic Association, and a service organization called the People's Emergency Center CDC. Strategic cohesion among these groups had begun with the University City High School negotiations and continued as the federal government declared a portion of this area a promise zone and promise neighborhood. So there was a big spotlight kind of on the lower Lancaster corridor neighborhoods, what would happen with them. And these 4 groups had built enough trust by 2016 to kind of present themselves to Brandywine as an authentic representative of the community's interests. And they were in the midst of negotiating with Brandywine when the Planning Commission heard testimony in 2017. So these remarks that 2 negotiators traded via a reporter at this 2017 City Planning Commission hearing kind of makes clear some of the issues at stake in the negotiation. From Brandywine's perspective, it was absurd to hold a private company responsible for outcomes in the neighborhoods that they saw as being kind of on the fringes of their investment. But the John Phillips, the president of Powelton Village Civic Association, had concerns, and Mantua organizations who were also present at the meeting were bringing the issue of affordable housing very much more forcefully into the public conversation about this project. So what they were doing, again, not to put too fine a point out, is asking for, in addition to mitigative measures to ensure that the development fit with the city fabric and didn't cause too many nuisances, they were asking for $72 million in cash, which they intended to use to provide programming for economically disadvantaged youth and acquire land where mission-driven organizations would build deeply affordable housing. And the $72 million number actually came from a study that these groups did in collaboration with Philadelphia LISC of similar community benefits agreements in other places. And they said, they looked at the total development cost number, and they said that typically CBAs had yielded benefits that were equivalent to about 5% of that. So that was the kind of rationale for their ask of 72 million. So, I mean, and it's, I guess, also kind of worth mentioning that the city and Drexel University itself kind of just, they put Brandywine in at the negotiating table with the community groups. They were not involved at all. So you kind of had this situation where you had a private developer negotiating with these community groups, and the city and Drexel were kind of staying out of it. So if some commentators thought it was inappropriate for community groups to be making asks of Brandywine, other commentators thought that the entire community benefits process was a poor substitute for what should have been a deeper critique of the development. There were a lot of layers of federal and state and city subsidy. There's a lot of tax privileged land in this area. There's a lot of foregone income tax revenue on the federal level and the state level. While Drexel and Brandywine were advancing a narrative that positioned subsidized property investment by the private sector as self-evidently and universally desirable, good for the city, good for the region, good for everybody, some people felt that this narrative conflated real estate return with broadly beneficial economic development and failed to account for the collateral impact that the project would have on low socioeconomic status households, absent an effort to decommodify land and housing in their neighborhoods. Okay, so this is the community benefits agreement itself, and they did not get $72 million. They got about $9 million over the course of about 12 years. And this community fund is an interesting entity in that it's run by the 4 groups that negotiated the community benefits agreement, along with a representative of the local council person, who's no longer the same person who forced the community benefits agreement to be negotiated. But it's a pretty democratic structure for decision making about how to deploy this capital. Of course, anybody who knows kind of urban development markets knows that $620,000 doesn't go all that far, to acquire land or to build housing or to keep rents low. So this was definitely a victory, but in some ways it was certainly less than some people had hoped it would be. So now I'm going to kind of engage in some comparative reflections on the 2 negotiations, the College Hall sit-in in 1969 and the Schuylkill Yards community benefits negotiation 48 years later in 2017. You have, in both cases, you have a situation where university-led redevelopment is affecting adjacent neighborhoods, this time through secondary displacement. You have innovation sort of conceptualized as the answer to all the issues that have arisen in the urban economy, including poverty and economic inequality. And you have this valorization of sort of science and commerce married together in a real estate project as really kind of the answer to the city's needs. And then as part of that elevation of these new neighborhoods and their economic promise and potential, you have space identified with Black communities being devalued. And in the book, I talk about territorial stigmatization as an element of the redevelopment playbook in a lot of different situations, and wherever areas identified with minority groups, and particularly with Black communities, are implicated, there's sort of a stigma that creeps into the discourse. And when the redevelopment official or the redevelopment actor is a university, the rhetoric of stigmatization takes on even a greater significance, because academic institutions lay special claim to qualities such as knowledge and creativity and ingenuity that are purportedly central to the success of an innovation district. But by implication, these qualities are seen to be absent from the materially poor communities nearby. And I know you had Akira Drake Rodriguez here a few months ago, and she really talks about acts of redevelopment being inseparable from racialized political geography. And I think that's very much true in this case. But also the continuities, another continuity is that civic groups mobilize to advocate for the interests of incumbent residents. And whereas in 1969, that was those people were completely ignored essentially and moved aside. In this case, they had a little bit more traction, a little bit more purchase on the process, and they were able to assert their claim on place. So those are some continuities, and but then there's also some differences. We think about redevelopment planning differently today. We have sort of sense of contrition about urban renewal. That's those days. We don't displace people directly anymore. And there is that. Also, cities are growing, and they're increasingly attractive destinations for people with disposable income. So Philadelphia has grown in the last couple of decades, although it's worth noting that it still has 365,000 fewer people and 200,000 fewer jobs than it had when the Science Center was completed in the early 1970s. So it's far from a success story, and you can understand why people who balance the budget in Philadelphia every year really just try to grasp at every possible development opportunity that could possibly exist. But you do have this sort of sense of the triumph of the city and cities as being attractive destinations as opposed to places that are just invested. Another thing is that government really federal government isn't dedicating money to urban projects in any real way. Even though this area was declared a promise zone, there was not really actually any funding associated with that designation. And as one of my interviewees said, well, you can promise to take me to dinner, but at dinner time, I'll still be hungry. And so really you have like a really sort of shrunken role for the federal government in particular, but government in general and urban policy. Finally, the university-sponsored innovation districts have become kind of a standard real estate product that's marketed to investors. So the typical structure is that there's a ground lease payment that's deductible from a corporate income tax. You're developing on university land through a long-term ground lease. And so the university is achieving revenue, but then universities also provide rents to the developers because their academic buildings are located in the innovation districts and so on. There's also, the university is also increasingly sort of seen as a partner for community development. And it was definitely the case that Drexel University was engaging in a lot of outreach to local, economically vulnerable households. They were providing legal services, tutoring, community meals, entrepreneurship clinics, pandemic relief. So you did have a sense that the university was cared about inclusion, cared about economic mobility. But there was still sort of, and this is an example of the Dornsife Center, which was located on Spring Garden Avenue, not very far from Lancaster, but a few blocks away, is a kind of the physical emblem of Drexel's commitment to lifting up residents in neighborhoods that struggling economically. And also, as I mentioned before, you have greater political voice and representation for mobilized civic groups. But there's still the stubborn issue of land. And so, and because of innovation districts work, when they work as they are supposed to, for investors, they're going to inevitably push up land prices nearby, and that creates potential issues. So, and this is just a map from the Mantua transformation plan of all the vacant land in the neighborhood, and about half of it you can't see because the grayscale doesn't come off very well, but half of it is publicly owned. So this is land that the city could have sort of given over to development that kind of met the needs of the people in the existing neighborhood, but the city itself was in a kind of a bind in the sense that they had a lot of these properties in a land bank, but the purpose of the land bank seemed to be to raise revenue to plug the city's budget gaps. So efforts to try to get the city to say, and there was Mount Vernon Manor CDC had an effort to establish a community land trust that wasn't really going over very well, because that was going to decommodify land, and the city government sort of needed land to be commodified in order for the to meet the pave the streets and pick up the garbage and so forth. So the recommendations that I make in the book are geared toward aggressive interventions that remove at least some land and land and housing from the speculative marketplace, in order that people of moderate means can continue to live in these improving neighborhoods, because they are improving neighborhoods, and they're places where amenities like public space, access to healthy food, and high performing schools are going to be really intensifying in the next few years. So there's an opportunity. So these are some of the recommendations that I make in the book to try to ensure that residents of Mantua in particular, and some of the other neighborhoods on the lower Lancaster corridor, will be able to benefit from the investments that are being made nearby. There's an opportunity to do this right now, because on 40th and Market Street, which is kind of adjacent to this area, there's a housing development called the University City Townhomes, which a private owner has been operating under a contract with HUD. It was built in the early 80s with equity as a project-based Section 8 development. But the affordability period that was required by the various financing of the housing has expired, and the current owners now are planning to sell this property they're asking $100 million for it, and they've notified the residents that they're going to be evicted. There's been a lot of pushback. There's been student demonstrations and community demonstrations, and there are still tenants there. And there's rumors now that there's a plan to build some affordable housing on the site, in addition to the market rate development that would have been produced in absence of some kind of a deal. But the resident-led movement to save the townhomes has really developed, in a strong way. And I think you can attribute some of the strength of the resistance to the memories of what was going on in 1969 when the Black Bottom was demolished. There's a kind of lineage of activism and protests that it's manifesting today. So I also have some broader recommendations, and they're not sort of specific policies, but one of them is that we kind of expand our definition of investment to cover investment that's non-financial in nature. So investment of time, investment of care, investment of social capital. The idea is that economic development officials tend to focus on the number of square feet that are going to be built and the number of dollars of capital invested. And, activists conceive of investment in very different ways, in ways that's not possible to denominate in dollars. And planners can start to honor these. Also, planners and economic development policymakers can change the way that they think about innovation. Reliance on real estate return as the animating force behind innovation-led economic development confines planners to the belief that only by attracting new residents and employees to newly constructed neighborhoods can cities generate vibrancy and prosperity. This is actually an image of some of the housing that's being built, or it is built. This is what it looks like. And it's in the U City Square Innovation District. And it's, it's the economic success of that project is being measured in terms of the arrival of new knowledge workers who are renting apartments in places like this one. But people with worthwhile ideas are living in older neighborhoods too. And it's worth just thinking about that, just because you are paying $2,500 a month in rent for a 1-bedroom, does that make you an innovator? Are there innovators maybe who aren't capable of that affording that kind of housing? The third point is really about history. I think there's been a lot of conversations about reparations, about thinking about a cumulative inequality forces that result in today's distribution of wealth and income, in a milieu, in this milieu, still, even though there are some talking about reparations, there's a lot of political discourse that reinforces the belief that low educational attainment and economic vulnerability and encounters with criminal justice system stem primarily from people's own limitations and flaws in their own poor choices. And so policy measures like the ones I was talking about a few minutes ago are sort of seen as unwarranted because somehow they would disrupt sort of the meritocratic order of things. That's I think that can be defied and pushed back against, and that's part of what I'm trying to do in the book. And perhaps if some of these conceptual shifts occur, it might become easier to persuade universities and city officials to adopt some of the policies that ensure low-income people living near university-sponsored redevelopment projects will be able to stay put and experience the benefits of innovation-based urban revitalization. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm gonna end the recording.
Okay.
Does anyone have any questions?
I think there's one in the chat.
I think that